Welcome to the History AI podcast, where the past comes alive with facts, anecdotes, and a dash of humor. Here are your hosts, Chuck and Marco.
Welcome back, history buffs, to another episode of the History AI podcast. I'm your host, Chuck.
And I'm Marco, your co-pilot on this historical journey. Chuck, today we're diving into one of the most catastrophic natural events in history, so catastrophic in fact, it's often referred to as the worst year to be alive. We're talking about the volcanic winter of 536.
Yes. 536 AD, the year the world went dark. It wasn't just some regional disaster either, this was global. The effects rippled through Europe, the Middle East, and even parts of Asia. But before we dive in, Marco, how's your week been?
Oh, just surviving my own mini-volcanic eruption of paperwork. But nothing compared to the climate chaos we're about to talk about.
Nice segue. Listeners, buckle up because this episode will show just how devastating nature can be. And trust me, after hearing this, your rainy Monday won't feel so bad.
Unless your Monday looks like it did in 536. Let's dive into it.
Alright, let's rewind the clock to 536 AD. At first glance, it seems like a relatively uneventful year in the grand scheme of history, until everything changes. To set the stage, the Roman Empire in the West had already fallen, officially collapsing in 476 AD. Europe was fragmented into various Germanic kingdoms, with the Byzantine Empire, centered in Constantinople, acting as the last stronghold of Roman glory. Emperor Justinian I was on the throne, trying to restore the empire's lost territories and re-establish Roman greatness.
Yeah, and beyond Europe, the world was equally complex. Persia, ruled by the Sasanian Empire, was the Byzantine Empire's biggest rival. The two superpowers were constantly in conflict, engaged in what seemed like endless wars along their borders. Further east, China was in a period of division during the era known as the Northern and Southern dynasties. So, geopolitically speaking, the world was already in a delicate state. But what was coming was something far worse than any political rivalry or military conflict.
Exactly. And then, it happened. The skies darkened, and the sun's light was dimmed for months, 18 months to be exact, according to the historian Procopius. Now, we need to give Procopius some credit because he wasn't exaggerating for dramatic effect. He described the sun as giving forth its light without brightness, like the moon, which perfectly captures the eerie, unnatural atmosphere that settled over the world.
The key cause of this darkness was a massive volcanic eruption, though at the time, people didn't know it. Most likely, this was a supervolcanic eruption, and modern scientists have narrowed it down to a couple of potential locations. Ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica, which act like natural time capsules, show a sudden spike in sulfate particles that point to a colossal volcanic event. Current theories suggest the culprit was either a volcano in Iceland or possibly a volcanic range in North America. The eruption was so enormous that ash, dust, and sulfur were blasted into the stratosphere, forming a thick veil around the Earth.
To give some perspective on how massive this eruption was, think about this. When Mount Tambora erupted in 1815, it caused what became known as the year without a summer in 1816, where global temperatures dropped and crops failed across Europe and North America. The eruption in 536 was likely even bigger, potentially one of the largest eruptions in human history. The sheer amount of volcanic material ejected into the atmosphere was enough to block sunlight for over a year.
And with less sunlight, global temperatures dropped dramatically. Estimates suggest that the Earth's average temperature fell by as much as 2.5 to 3 degrees Celsius or about 3.6 to 5.4 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, that might not sound like much, but in an agrarian society, it was devastating. Even a small drop in temperature can ruin crop cycles, and back then, there were no stockpiled food reserves or sophisticated irrigation systems. People depended on seasonal harvests, and with those harvests failing, famine set in.
And this wasn't just a regional event either. Records from all over the world mention strange weather and widespread suffering. In Ireland, historical annals describe a failure of bread from 536 to 539. In China, chroniclers from the Northern Wei dynasty report summer snowfalls and widespread droughts. Similar accounts come from the Middle East, where agricultural lands that were once fertile turned barren. Essentially, it was a climate catastrophe on a global scale.
That's the crazy thing, this wasn't just about hunger or cold. The disruption of agriculture led to mass migrations, social unrest, and political instability. The economy in Europe and the Middle East, which already struggled with post-Roman decentralization, went into further disarray. People who were barely getting by before were now starving. In some places, entire communities collapsed.
And it wasn't just people. Ecosystems were thrown out of balance. Animals suffered from the same food shortages as humans. Cold, wet conditions, combined with the lack of sunlight, meant less plant growth, which, in turn, meant less food for livestock and wildlife. The ecological chain was disrupted from top to bottom.
And the worst part? No one knew what was happening. In the 6th century, there was no scientific understanding of volcanic eruptions or climate. People thought it was a divine punishment or an omen of the apocalypse. Procopius even wrote that many believed the sun's dimming signaled the end of the world. Imagine the fear that would spread in a society already dealing with war, famine, and political collapse. It's not hard to understand why many thought the end times were upon them.
It's wild when you think about it. Imagine waking up every day to a dim, shadowy world, not knowing if the sun would ever shine again. You can't grow food, you can't predict the weather, and there's no real explanation for why it's happening. No wonder so many societies across the globe were pushed to the brink of collapse.
To make matters worse, this wasn't a quick disaster. The effects lasted for years. The dimmed sunlight and the colder temperatures lingered for about 18 months, but the aftershocks, famines, economic crashes, and societal unrest continued for much longer. This wasn't just a bad year, it was a prolonged period of suffering that would ripple through history for decades to come.
And we're only scratching the surface here. The volcanic eruption of 536 set off a domino effect that would reshape the world in ways people back then couldn't possibly understand. It wasn't just about the immediate suffering, it laid the groundwork for future disasters, famines, plagues, and political upheaval that would define the era.
And with that, the world was thrown into one of its darkest periods, both literally and metaphorically. The global consequences would be felt for decades. Now that we've painted a picture of the immediate effects of the volcanic eruption in 536 AD, let's dive into the long-term consequences. This wasn't just about a temporary disruption. The volcanic winter set off a chain of catastrophic events that reverberated across the globe for decades, if not centuries. The world was changed forever.
Absolutely. The global climate disruption led to a series of famines, plagues, and societal collapses. It's like a historical domino effect, one disaster would knock over the next. And what makes this period so significant is how widespread and interconnected these consequences were. Let's start with Europe, where the darkness over the skies was felt the hardest.
In Europe, the famine was brutal. Crops failed for years due to the cold and lack of sunlight. In places like Ireland, as we mentioned, historical records talk about a failure of bread for 3 years, from 536 to 539 AD. It's not hard to imagine what that meant for the population. Starvation was rampant, and when people go hungry, they become desperate. Crime, conflict, and migration surged as communities struggled to survive.
And famine wasn't the only thing people had to deal with. The volcanic winter weakened immune systems, making populations more susceptible to disease. Just a few years later, in 541 AD, the first recorded outbreak of the bubonic plague struck, the infamous plague of Justinian. It's widely believed that the weakened and malnourished state of the population due to the volcanic winter made it easier for the plague to spread like wildfire.
Right. The plague of Justinian is often overshadowed by the later Black Death, but make no mistake, this plague was devastating. Some estimates suggest it killed 25 to 50 million people, about half the population of Europe at the time. Cities like Constantinople, the Byzantine capital, were hit particularly hard, losing tens of thousands of people in just a few months.
The plague wasn't just a human tragedy, it had far-reaching political and economic impacts. For the Byzantine Empire, it couldn't have come at a worse time. Emperor Justinian I was in the middle of a grand campaign to reconquer the Western Roman territories, which had fallen to barbarian kingdoms. He had been successful in reclaiming parts of Italy, North Africa, and Spain, but the plague decimated his army and administration, grinding his military ambitions to a halt.
Exactly. The Byzantine Empire never fully recovered from the plague. It weakened their ability to defend their borders, especially against their long-standing rivals, the Sasanian Empire. The economic toll was immense, fields lay fallow, cities emptied, and trade networks collapsed. Justinian's grand vision of reuniting the Roman world was crippled, and the long-term effects helped set the stage for the eventual rise of the Islamic Caliphate in the 7th century, which would go on to conquer vast swathes of former Byzantine and Persian territory.
Speaking of the Sasanian Empire, they didn't escape unscathed either. Persia was also hit hard by the climatic disruptions of 536, followed by the plague. Their economy, heavily reliant on agriculture, took a significant hit. The internal chaos weakened the empire's ability to project power, and like the Byzantines, they struggled to fend off external threats in the years to come.
But the devastation wasn't confined to Europe and the Middle East. Let's head east to China, where the effects of the volcanic winter were equally catastrophic. The Northern Wei dynasty, which had been a dominant power in northern China, saw its grip on power slip during this time. In the years following 536, China experienced droughts, failed harvests, and widespread famines. These environmental crises contributed to internal strife and rebellion, leading to the eventual collapse of the Northern Wei in 535.
Right, and when the Northern Wei collapsed, China entered a period of fragmentation and chaos known as the Northern and Southern Dynasties era. This period of division and civil war created instability for decades, making it difficult for any one dynasty to consolidate power. The ripple effects of the volcanic winter can be seen in how these dynasties struggled to maintain control in the face of climate-induced famine and political turmoil.
Meanwhile, in Mesoamerica, we see evidence of climate-related collapse in one of the most powerful cities of the ancient world, Teotihuacan. At its height, Teotihuacan was one of the largest cities in the world, with an estimated population of over 100,000 people. But during the mid-6th century, right around the time of the volcanic winter, Teotihuacan began to decline rapidly. While it's difficult to say with certainty that the volcanic winter was the sole cause, it's likely that the resulting crop failures, food shortages, and social unrest contributed to the city's downfall.
This pattern of decline isn't isolated. Across the world, societies that had been prosperous and powerful saw their foundations shaken. The interconnected nature of trade and agriculture meant that even distant regions could feel the shockwaves. And, of course, when civilizations falter, migrations often follow.
That's a great point. The migrations of this period had profound long-term effects. In Europe, for example, the Slavic peoples began moving into territories vacated by Germanic tribes, setting the stage for future conflicts and cultural shifts. Similarly, in Central Asia, nomadic tribes like the Avars and Turks were on the move, driven in part by the climatic upheavals and the collapse of settled societies. These migrations would redraw the political map of Eurasia in the centuries to come.
It's fascinating how a single volcanic event could trigger such widespread change. But what's even more interesting is how these societies adapted, or failed to adapt, to the crisis. Some, like the Byzantine Empire, managed to hold on, albeit with severe losses. Others, like the Northern Wei and Teotihuacan, didn't survive the shock.
Exactly. The eruption of 536 revealed the fragility of human societies, especially those that were already under strain from internal conflicts or external pressures. The interconnectedness of the world, even in the 6th century, meant that no one was immune to the effects. Trade routes collapsed, populations migrated, and economies crumbled. But in some cases, these challenges also sparked innovations.
That's a good point. For instance, in parts of Europe, some agricultural communities adapted by shifting away from more climate-sensitive crops to hardier alternatives. It wasn't an overnight solution, but it shows how humans can be incredibly resourceful in the face of disaster. Similarly, new political structures emerged in the aftermath, often taking advantage of the chaos to consolidate power or innovate in governance.
Exactly. In some ways, the volcanic winter acted as a crucible, testing the resilience of different societies. Those that could adapt, innovate, or centralize power managed to survive, even if it took decades to fully recover. But others weren't so lucky. Many regions faced a long, dark age of decline and disintegration.
And it's not just about the immediate effects. The climate crisis of 536 set off a ripple effect that influenced centuries of history. The weakened Byzantine Empire, the collapse of dynasties in China, the decline of Mesoamerican powers, and the migrations of tribes throughout Eurasia, all of these were triggered or exacerbated by that initial eruption.
It's mind-boggling to think that a volcanic event, something completely out of human control, could play such a pivotal role in shaping the future. The long-term global impacts of the volcanic winter of 536 remind us just how vulnerable human societies are to the forces of nature.
Now that we've gone through the devastating societal impacts of 536, let's step back and dive into the science behind what caused this global catastrophe. The truth is, while the people of the time had no idea what was happening, many thought it was a divine punishment or an apocalyptic event. Modern science has pieced together an impressive picture of how and why the sun dimmed, temperatures dropped, and the world was thrown into chaos.
Exactly. To understand the scale and effects of what happened, we first need to look at the role of volcanic eruptions in the global climate system. When a large volcano erupts, it ejects not only lava and ash, but also gases like sulfur dioxide, SO2, high into the atmosphere. Now, the 536 eruption wasn't your average volcanic event.
The stratosphere
We're talking about a massive explosion, most likely a supervolcanic eruption that sent these particles soaring into the stratosphere.
Once volcanic gases like sulfur dioxide reach the stratosphere, they're out of the reach of the usual processes that clear particles from the lower atmosphere, things like rain and wind. These particles can hang around for months, even years, which is exactly what happened in 536.
When sulfur dioxide combines with water vapor in the stratosphere, it forms tiny sulfuric acid droplets, also known as sulfate aerosols. These aerosols act like tiny mirrors, reflecting sunlight away from the Earth. And here's the kicker, even a small reduction in sunlight can have a massive impact on global temperatures. The sulfate aerosols created from the eruption blocked enough sunlight to cause a significant cooling effect, known as volcanic winter.
To give some context, volcanic eruptions that inject sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere can lead to a temporary cooling of the Earth's surface because they essentially shield the planet from the sun's radiation. This process is why temperatures in 536 AD plummeted, and the world experienced what could be described as an 18-month-long twilight. Historical records from that time mention unusual weather patterns, summer frosts, snowfalls, and a dramatic drop in temperatures. The Northern Hemisphere, in particular, was hit hard.
So how do we know this actually happened? Well, modern scientists rely on multiple lines of evidence to reconstruct historical volcanic eruptions. One of the key tools is ice core analysis. Ice cores are long cylinders of ice drilled from glaciers or ice sheets, typically in places like Greenland and Antarctica. These cores contain layers of ice that have built up year after year, trapping tiny bubbles of air, dust, and particles like volcanic ash. Essentially, they are time capsules that preserve a record of past environmental conditions.
When scientists studied these ice cores, they found something remarkable. In the ice layers corresponding to 536 AD, there was a huge spike in sulfur and volcanic ash. This indicated that a massive eruption had occurred, likely somewhere in the Northern Hemisphere, that released a tremendous amount of material into the atmosphere. What's even more interesting is that these same cores show another spike a few years later, in 540 AD, suggesting that a second volcanic eruption occurred shortly after the first, compounding the effects of the initial disaster.
Yeah, it's almost like the world got hit with a 1-2 punch. The eruption in 536 was already devastating, but the second eruption only worsened the already fragile climate conditions. This helps explain why recovery was so slow and why famine, disease, and societal collapse dragged on for years. The cumulative impact of multiple eruptions left the global climate destabilized for over a decade.
The combination of these eruptions caused the Earth's temperature to drop by as much as 2.5 to 3 degrees Celsius. To put that into perspective, we're currently worrying about climate change and global warming increasing temperatures by just 1 or 2 degrees over the next century. Imagine an almost immediate drop of 2.5 degrees, with no modern infrastructure, no central heating, and food production entirely dependent on the seasons. It would have been catastrophic for any society relying on agriculture.
Exactly, and that's why we saw such widespread crop failures. Without enough sunlight, photosynthesis slows down, which means crops don't grow properly or at all. Historical records from places like Ireland, China, and the Byzantine Empire all report severe food shortages, which weren't just localized incidents, they were happening across the northern hemisphere.
And it's not just food production that suffered. The cooling of the planet led to shifts in weather patterns. The monsoon systems in Africa and India were disrupted, leading to droughts in some areas and flooding in others. These unpredictable weather patterns made an already dire situation even worse.
Interestingly, the impact wasn't just short-term. Studies of tree rings from this period, known as dendrochronology, show that trees in the northern hemisphere had significantly reduced growth during the mid-530s. Tree rings from 536 to 545 AD are noticeably thinner than in surrounding years, reflecting how prolonged the environmental stress was. This supports the idea that even after the immediate effects of the volcanic winter ended, the planet continued to feel its impact for nearly a decade.
And then there's the mysterious fog that many historical sources mention. Some accounts describe the sky being shrouded in a dry fog that made it difficult to see the sun. This fog wasn't a typical weather event like mist or smoke from nearby fires, it was the result of those aerosols lingering in the stratosphere. While volcanic ash can fall to the ground relatively quickly, the finer sulfate aerosols can stay suspended for much longer, creating that eerie, hazy atmosphere.
The fog and cooling weren't just a visual or climatic inconvenience, they had real, deadly consequences. As we discussed earlier, the agricultural collapse led to famines, and weakened populations were more susceptible to disease. The cooler, wetter conditions may have even created the perfect breeding grounds for the fleas and rats that carried the Yersinia pestis bacterium, which caused the bubonic plague.
The fact that scientists have been able to piece together this entire sequence of events is incredible. By combining ancient written records with modern tools like ice cores, tree rings, and even volcanic tephra, small bits of volcanic rock found in soil and ice layers, researchers have reconstructed the volcanic eruptions that brought the world to its knees in 536.
And even though the eruption likely originated in Iceland or North America, the effects were felt globally. Some scientists have even suggested that the scale of the eruption could have been similar to that of the famous eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815, which caused the year without a summer. But, in the case of 536, the impact was even more prolonged and severe.
And it's fascinating to consider how this volcanic winter would have been perceived at the time. Without any understanding of volcanic activity or climate science, people in 536 would have seen the dimming of the sun, the failing crops, and the famine as signs of divine punishment, supernatural events, or even the end of the world.
That's why we see so many written accounts describing this period as apocalyptic. Procopius, the Byzantine historian, was just one of many who wrote about the sun appearing like the moon, emitting no warmth. Similar records from other parts of the world show just how widespread the phenomenon was, but they all share that sense of dread and confusion. No one could have guessed that a distant volcano was the root cause of their suffering.
Exactly. And the terrifying part is that even though we now understand the science behind these events, humanity remains vulnerable to future volcanic eruptions. Large-scale volcanic eruptions are unpredictable, and if something on the scale of 536 or Tambora were to happen today, the global impacts on agriculture, trade, and society could be equally devastating, though at least we'd have a better understanding of the cause.
That's right. Even with modern technology and a more interconnected global economy, a massive volcanic eruption could disrupt air travel, collapse food systems, and cause widespread political and economic instability. It's a sobering reminder of just how powerful natural forces can be and how they've shaped the course of human history.
And that's the science behind the volcanic winter of 536, a perfect example of how something completely beyond human control can send shockwaves through the world, changing everything in its wake.
So Chuck, after all of this, would you say 536 was the worst year to be alive?
If it's not, it's definitely in the top 3. You've got a global volcanic winter, famines, economic collapse, and plague. Yeah, it was a rough time.
But the story of 536 is also a testament to human resilience. Despite all the hardship, societies adapted, rebuilt, and survived. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, people find ways to push through.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that while natural disasters can devastate societies, they also often lead to innovations and new ways of thinking. The aftermath of 536 helped shape the medieval world as we know it.
And that, folks, is why history is so fascinating. Every event, even a volcanic winter, plays a role in shaping the future.
That's a wrap for today's episode of the History AI podcast. We hope you enjoyed learning about the volcanic winter of 536 and its massive impact on the world.
Remember to rate, subscribe, and share this podcast. A 5-star review really helps us grow and reach more listeners who love diving into the past as much as we do.
And don't forget, we've got merch now. Check out our historical threads, the link is in the show notes. Also, hit us up on social media with your topic suggestions. We're always looking for fresh ideas.
Thanks again for tuning in, and remember, every episode of the History AI podcast is evergreen, so you can go back and listen to any episode anytime.
We'll catch you next time. Stay curious. Discover the dark, enchanting world of shadowed journeys, the tales of Jordan and Squishy. Follow Jordan, a seemingly innocent girl with a hidden power, and her loyal companion Squishy, who reincarnates into different animals after each battle. Venture into the ominous depths of the Whispering Woods as they face fierce creatures and uncover ancient secrets. Will Jordan succumb to the darkness within, or will she find the strength to forge a new destiny? Perfect for fans of dark fantasy and epic quests, this spellbinding tale will captivate and leave you pondering the fine line between hero and villain. Dive into Shadowed Journeys today. Available on Amazon now.